The story of modern medicine and public hygiene is a story of success, a story of saved lives, longer lives, a reduction of infant mortality, eradicated diseases and subdued parasites. It's the story of cleansing, control, predictability, pasteurization. The heroes of modern medicine are antibiotics, which have overcome infectious diseases, inflammations, and human life-endangering microscopic organisms. However, the triumphant march of modern medicine also has its reverse side. Control and predictability are often only temporary, whilst cleansing of bodies and ecosystems from biodiversity may not be of long-term benefit for life. We do not wish to deny the successes of modern medicine, but we wish to make visible and audible the background noise, the seepages, parasites, unintended consequences, biological fellow travelers, and physiological collectives from which something like an individual human being can, however temporarily and vulnerably, emerge. We wish to speak of the value of hybridization, about the fact that life is a collective experiment and not a predictable and fully controllable individual project. We shall behave as a parasite, which in the sense of the French parasite refers not only to a parasite in the familiar meaning, but also to a radioelectric hum, an unsettling murmur that creates disorder and enables the advent of another order. We wish to say that it is not necessary to fear a biological view of society, which in no way has to take the form only of evolutionary biology and Darwinism, which essentialize the differences between men and women or ethnic groups and races. On the contrary, contemporary biology may be a source of highly diverse arguments and inspirations. Following the phase of the modernist fetish for classifying pure forms, today the interconnection of the living in various forms, the subtle coexistence of organisms, including humans, and their complex dependencies are coming ever increasingly to the fore. We start out from those points where modern medicine comes up against the limits of its victorious march and overwhelms itself, as in the case of the massive spread of resistance to antibiotics or the eradication of a range of parasites in our part of the world, which is probably connected to an increase in autoimmune disorders. Until recently, or up to now, humans have been considered a single organism whose genome we know and which we can continue to recognize, decode all the mechanisms in its cells, and thereby resolve the problem relating to health. Scientists and doctors knew that we are host to a whole range of organisms, mostly bacteria, but until recently it was not practically possible to study these, as a result of which nobody focused on them. Thus, by definition, the influence of this element is considered insubstantial. So I in fact see a methodological breakthrough when methods appear that enable the study of this element of human bodies and determine that there are more non-human cells in the human organism than human ones, which in itself is a pretty dramatic finding. And these organisms have a much greater influence on us than previously thought, and in all of us, that's beyond all doubt. And from here, it's not such a long way to the idea that health problems or how we appear is determined not only by our genetic information, not only by our upbringing, diet, where we live, the environment we spend our time in, but also by a third element, which means the organisms that live inside us. And we know that some people are better off and others worse off, which means that some people have these organisms in a better composition balance and structure, and others worse. And this has also been shown to be true. So in the future, I can certainly imagine that we'll go to the chemist and get especially what I'd call that microbiota, that bacterial component. We'll get pills that, for example, stimulate that bacterial component after we've taken antibiotics. So it would be taken straight after the antibiotics. This isn't sci-fi. These are things that are either being studied at the present time or are already being realized on a small scale in clinical practice. If we consider whether these parasites are truly and only bad, or whether they actually have some purpose to their existence, then we have to answer that without parasites as such, we wouldn't be here at all, which seems like a very radical pronouncement, and so I'll try to explain it here. We mustn't view these parasites only in the sense that they are tapeworms or agents of sleeping sickness, ticks that suck our blood, or head lice, but that overall there are many more examples of life forms which have this parasitic way of life. There are lots of bacteria living inside our bodies. These are understandably all those viruses. They can't live by themselves. They always have to be parasitic in some way. This means utilizing the cells of their host, and we could even come to the conclusion that there is parasitic DNA here. When we look at our genome, once it's been so magnificently decoded, the last letter of the human genome, which in itself took a very long time. Using these contemporary methods, what in the distance took us 10 years, we're now able to do in 1 or 2 days. And when this human genome was decoded, it was demonstrated that it's these genes. These are the basic building blocks with whose help proteins are generated. Our body, and in fact the majority of things function in that these genes take up only 1% of our genome. It's debatable as to what the rest is, but at present we can say that around 10% of our genome is parasitic DNA. This is DNA that has got there somehow from outside, in most cases with the help of some kind of viral particles, and was subsequently able to multiply in our genome. Although it's no longer multiplying anymore, it still remains there. This means that in this great genome that humans have, only a tiny 1% is made up of genes, whilst 10%, for example 10 times more, is parasitic DNA. Scientists are still working out what the remainder is, and it's possible that we'll also be able to consider a part of this DNA also to be in some way parasitic. Another part has regulatory developmental functions and so on. So this in itself is interesting, that these parasites are present in a certain manner on all possible levels of the organization of live matter. Then we could proceed to those viruses, bacteria, and then, understandably, to those classic parasites as we understand them, meaning helminths or parasitic worms, single-cell organisms, and, for example, ectoparasites originating from insects or arthropods in general. So this is a kind of contemplation of all the places we encounter these parasites, and at the moment we start to understand them in this broader perspective, we can then take a look back at this evolution, when they appeared here, and if they in some way influenced life and the origin of life here on this planet. And we can find that this is truly the case. Incidentally, it's entirely possible. I'm not saying it's the only explanation, but it's one of the explanations, that the origin of eukaryotic cells as we know them at present was partially conditioned by parasitism. Everyone's probably heard that our cells contain mitochondria. These are tiny factories which ensure our respiratory function, and their activity generates the universal fuel that feeds our cells. This fuel is called APP. It's not important to explain exactly what this is here, but it's a kind of heating fuel, thanks to which our cells function in the way that it should. This fuel is generated by mitochondria, and these first originated from so-called alpha proteobacteria, and it seems that from the beginning these bacteria got into these cells not by chance or because they were consumed, but because they were parasites. They penetrated these cells and began to be parasitic upon them. But after a longer period of evolution, a kind of consensus was reached in which they remained here and began to provide some positive benefits for the cell, and the cell retained them as a result. But at the beginning, they were actually parasites. If this hadn't occurred, God only knows if we'd ever have evolved the way we have. And understandably, the origin of eukaryotic cells was the fundamental building block for multicellular life to emerge. So it's possible that if parasites didn't exist, then we'd be talking here like two kind of single-cell amoebas, and we wouldn't even be breathing oxygen. We would be breathing some other method. It appears that several behavioral models can be entirely fundamentally influenced by our microbiota. In the majority of cases, this influence is positive, and as a result, we don't know anything about it. Simply, those microbes that produce certain essential substances for us that we're unable to synthesize, they, for example, shift the immune system in such a direction that we react to what we're supposed to react to, and we don't react to harmless things. When we got rid of maggots, tapeworms in our digestive system, this is a matter that's only 100 years old, not even that. The fact that we don't have pinworms, roundworms, at least here in Europe, has been shown to be a great mishap. We're suddenly faced with a dramatic increase in autoimmune diseases, allergies. This huge increase in allergies is most probably a consequence of the fact that we've rid ourselves of helminths. Because helminths, in order not to be expelled from the organism, shift the balance between the cellular component of immunity and the humoral component of immunity. These are antibodies which ensure not only that they themselves are not attacked, but also that allergies don't occur. When this pressure of helminths suddenly disappeared, this shifted us somewhere else, and suddenly there are negative consequences. But our microbiota also has certain negative influences. When, for example, we're not so lucky, if we discharge our natural microbiota and acquire another, less appropriate one, then the result might be a serious illness, whether this concerns stomach ulcers or even psychological disorders. Until recently, parasites were thought of as something to be wiped out. They simply always cause harm. I'd say that this view was universally accepted, but this boundary doesn't exist, and the reality is more complicated. As science has shown in a whole range of disciplines, these parasites are coming into play, and I wouldn't even now call them parasites, but rather eukaryotes that live within us under certain circumstances. How do we deal with these new observations and hypotheses, and how do we put them into practice? In many cases, it could suffice to rediscover and read anew our own history. Modernity was never as modern and clean as it imagined itself to be. It incorporated all kinds of background noise, subversions and experiments which escaped the dominant trends and categories. Within this context, a concept worthy of note is physiological collectivism, advanced by the initially distinguished and later marginalized doctor and revolutionary Alexander Bogdanov. In his science fiction novel Red Star, written in 1905, he describes an advanced communist society on Mars in which mutual blood transfusions are used as a practice for prolonging life and increasing the vitality of the Martians. Bogdanov went much further than the then risky but nevertheless used transfusions in the case of a larger loss of blood. He experimented with the mutual connection of the circulatory system in 2 or more persons, including himself in these experiments. In his view, this connection was meant to be beneficial for all those taking part, since the older would immunize the younger, whilst conversely, the older would take from the young substances their bodies no longer produced to such an extent or whatsoever. In Bogdanov's view, the physiological connection of individuals strengthens society as a whole. Regardless of how its protagonists were seen at the time, a range of practices from physiological collectivism were, and are, and appear to an ever-increasing extent to be a component of medicine. If it's so simple, then why does our medicine not yet make use of this method on Earth? If I'm not mistaken, given blood has been known about on Earth for several hundred years, asks an Earthling of a Martian doctor in Bogdanov's novel. I don't know. Perhaps you have some kind of peculiar organic conditions that strips this method of its significance on Earth. Maybe also it's a result of the governing individualistic psychology on Earth that so sharply separates one human from another, that the idea of their live interconnection seems almost inadmissible to your scholars. In addition, there are a large number of diseases on Earth which poison the blood, which the patients themselves are often unaware of or conceal. In your medicine also, in very rare cases, giving blood is practiced for philanthropic reasons. Those who have plenty of blood provide it to others who are in desperate need of it. For example, as a result of heavy bleeding from a wound. Such cases naturally also occur here, but in general, we use the method that fully corresponds to our constitution. Mutual exchange of life, not only in an ideological, but also a physiological sense. Interspecies physiological collectivism has also been used by some therapeutic procedures of classical European medicine. Upon reading the literature, I was actually struck by a parallel that I see in the awarding of the Nobel Prize to Julius Wagner-Jauregg 100 years ago for the treatment of syphilitic infections by malaria, which he performed especially in Romania. This concept, as is generally the case with the Nobel Prize winners, was brilliant, especially at that time, but afterwards it was condemned as unethical, unacceptable. Often it was done on these psychological, because in this stage of terminal syphilis, the subject was psychologically afflicted, and so there's a question as to whether the patient gave consent. The whole thing was cast into doubt, and in fact condemned, and then barely spoken about as a stigma of a handful of Nobel Prizes which were either shown to be a mistake or somehow rigged, or on the boundaries of acceptability. But as is often the case, 100 years later, I think it's good to look at these cases again through the eyes of today's knowledge, and I don't think that a similar method would be condemned anymore, when, for example, immune diseases or allergies are treated with the help of certain organisms that are introduced into the human body. Under certain conditions, obviously, it won't be a simple matter, but I'm convinced that it'll happen. More than 100 years after the experiments conducted by Alexander Bogdanov, Julius Wagner-Jauregg, and others, it's time to expand our conception of physiological collectivism and contemplate interspecies physiological collectivism. Let's try to imagine that physiological strengthening and cultivation of the existing interconnections between organisms is a possibility for the long-term prospects of life on Earth. This doesn't just concern a theory, but a whole range of already existing and entirely specific practices. It's of fundamental significance for the shift in contemporary forms of physiological collectivism to be just as momentous as when Bogdanov defined himself against one-way vector from donor to recipient in standard transfusions. We must approach a conscious introduction and moderation of organisms in a continuum between the exterior and interior of our bodies, not only as a service, donation, or therapy, but with a responsibility for a whole, which goes beyond the human individual and human society. Certain flies are able to act as parasites upon live tissue, and we refer to these as so-called miasmic flies. These are understandably highly unpleasant if they get into you, either into intact, undamaged skin, where they can cause various sores and damage, or they attack already damaged tissue. This skin may be damaged by trauma. In the past, it often happened, for example, in battles when the warriors were left lying on the battlefield and flies got into their wounded areas. However, a part of these flies are able to eat away at and liquidate that bad tissue, but fortunately don't attack the live tissue. And it's these flies that are our friends. People noticed this long ago. In fact, it was the Mayans who discovered that precisely these flies can help us cleanse and improve healing of certain battle wounds. Later, it was repeatedly discovered in the times of antiquity or of the European Middle Ages. Nevertheless, more general use of this procedure was pioneered by an American doctor during the Civil War, when he noticed that many soldiers who had been wounded in battle and had lain on the battlefield for a few days, in fact managed to overcome their injuries thanks to the development of these fly larvae, and healed better than those soldiers who hadn't been attacked by these flies. Use of this technique thus began in hospitals. It became a commonly used method in truly a large number of hospitals in the United States, and not only there. Nevertheless, later, on antibiotics, sulfonamides and other drugs were discovered, which progressively, in fact pretty quickly, squeezed out the use of flies. So it was as if this method was forgotten, but in the last 10 or 15 years it's been rediscovered. Further hypotheses are being tested and are the subject of professional and lay experiments. The organisms we carry inside ourselves also bring their genes. When we have 1,000 types of organisms inside us, then according to some estimates, we have approximately 100 times more genes that aren't human than those human genes. And these genes produce proteins, and these proteins do something inside us. Let's say they relate primarily to organisms which produce them, meaning that this microbe does something with them so that it can consume the nutrition it has around itself. But let's say that certain impulses occur with the result that all these microbes are eradicated. They die out quickly, which means that their proteins are released. Let's say that some of them are capable of getting into the blood circulation, in which case they get into the brain in an imperceptible quantity, which can't be identified, because we don't even know what we're supposed to identify, because we weren't looking for these proteins. So when we start looking for them, we determine that they're there. But even in an imperceptible quantity, in the brain, this can mean fundamental changes. So this is probably the place where this coexistence is transformed into very subtle relationships about which we again know virtually nothing. So if this microbiota plays a role in autism, then it will be in certain forms of autism. But I'll dare to claim that it does. And just as we've moved on from when we didn't attribute any role to microbes, or we did it most regarding whether or not we're suffering from diarrhea, now we attribute a role to them in a whole range of human diseases, and this spectrum is growing even wider. Since this concerns something entirely trivial, meaning a stool that we produce every day, then it's genuinely not difficult to imagine that people will exchange it. It's only certain ethical patterns of behavior that prevent it. If these are overcome in certain individuals, and these are desperate individuals who will try absolutely anything, then they'll exchange their stool on the internet. This is taking place at the moment. And there are videos, again, this is happening in wealthy countries. When you talk about this with Indian scientists, they truly look at you as if you're from another planet. And this is also because these diseases that we're trying to treat don't exist whatsoever in India. They're first of all overlain with those more serious diseases, but at the same time it seems that they genuinely don't exist there. So the exchange of stool will happen. Just very recently, and I mean in the last few weeks or months at most, an extremely influential company called the Food and Drug Administration, which is a body that regulates drugs in the United States, approves them. It stipulates that this drug, which costs $10 billion, can or cannot be introduced onto the market. And few organizations are so powerful and at the same time so little known as this one. This body has now stated that a stool is a medicament. This means that in fact it's going on in the American legislation that a stool is being defined as a drug. The debate as to whether a person is the owner of his or her own stool and can give it to someone hasn't been dealt with in the legislation because it was too bizarre, with the exception of some kind of necrophagia or something. Now, in fact, it's starting to be dealt with, defined, and we won't be able to do it. My view is that we won't be able to do it, so you won't be able to give your stool to someone else. Because it'll be monopolized by some company? Because it'll be, yes, commercialized. Doctors and scientists will come into it and claim the right to test this stool. For good reasons, because it'll no doubt happen that a stool kills someone or seriously harms them. You might transmit something you don't want to with that stool. So in order to prevent this and ensure this whole system works on the principle that if something's not 100% safe, then it can't even be attempted. And this is difficult, even in the system of a drug that's defined down to the last molecule, but in the system of a stool, in which each one is different. It depends on the day, on the time of day you produced it, on your health, on what you've eaten, and so on. This is an indefinable matter at this moment. So it can happen that it'll be completely blocked, and sharing a stool will be a criminal offense punishable by a year in prison, for example. That's the way it's heading at the moment.
Se může stát, že vlastně bude úplně zablokovaná a sdílet stolici bude zločin trestaný rokem vězení třeba. K tomu to spěje v tuhle chvíli.
Modernist evolutionary biology gave birth to and legitimized racism and the mass murder of what were said to be lower forms of human life. After the bloody 20th century, these previously widespread views were shifted out to the margins, but a new variant of them is emerging. Identity politics may not wish to murder, but it wishes to purify our space by other means, primarily by a thorough separation of various homogeneous cultures, bodies, or life forms. Each human monoculture must have its own monologue. In this view, life across these monocultures is neither possible nor desirable. What does it mean politically if, like contemporary biology, we place at the center of our interest interconnection, shifts, infiltrations, and permeability of boundaries? The recognition that coexistence and not pure forms are the basic mode of modern life. We have to learn to contemplate and occupy a position between extreme enclosure, essentialism, and hysterical fear of mixture on one hand, and on the other hand, naive goodwill and predetermined shared humanity or life, as if it was not necessary to assemble and shape a collective cautiously and carefully, culturally, materially, physiologically. An important lesson of parasitology is that interlinkage, which is disturbing and threatening, may at the same time be nourishing and life-giving. The Cemathoa crustacean attaches itself to the tongue of fish and drains blood from it. the tongue gradually atrophies until it falls out entirely and only a stump remains. The crustacean attaches itself firmly to this stump and entirely replaces the fish's tongue. The Samotha itself becomes a functional fish's tongue. No measurable difference has been found in length of life, weight, or overall condition of health between fish with an attached crustacean and without. Let's imagine that a Samotha may also infiltrate our bodies and become our own tongue. It's necessary to overcome the initial horror to allow this tongue to speak and listen to it. It will take a while before it becomes skillful at pronouncing. It will probably mumble and lisp, but we will eventually understand that it speaks about biocultural multiculturalism. It will help us to formulate the manner in which humanity can act as a parasite on this planet as ecologically as this fellow traveler Samotha. When we use this stump to say the International Monetary Fund via this crustacean extension of ourselves, we may instead pronounce International Gene Pool. When we say the Schengen Zone of free movement and firm external borders, we form the Schengen Zone of curiosity. When we say the United Nations, this becomes a cooperative of united localities. When we say the World Trade Organization, we unleash a cosmopolitan metabolism. When we say the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, a trans-ocean free movement and sustainability agreement is concluded. When we say religion, we can sense pheromones. When we say the Olympic Games, the Animalympic Games are established. When we say aristocracy, refined molds proliferate. When we say World Cup, we observe the stages of a field. When we say OPEC, places of fermentation start leaking. When we say nation-state, we hear the murmur of a transitory binding unit of coexistence. When we say family, biosocial queer proliferates. When we say us, vital syndicates of life are being formed.